a new CNN poll shows that support is slipping for the U.S. funding of the war in Ukraine. So we're just going to go straight to the main questions of the poll here. So this is SSRS. This was done for CNN. So do you think the United States should do more to stop Russian military actions in Ukraine, or has it already done enough? So in February of 2022, which is just days after the invasion, 62% said we should do more, 38% say we have done enough. Right now, as you can see, the majority answer that we have done enough, and only 48% answer that we should do more to stop Russian military action in Ukraine. On the big question, 15A at the bottom, do you think Congress should or should not authorize additional funding to support Ukraine in the war with Russia? So over the course of this previous month, July 1st to 31st, only 45% of Americans think we should authorize funding, and 55% we should not authorize any additional funding for the war in Ukraine. So you can see an overall momentum shift away from support for World War III, which is nice to see. And you can see on every metric, now these numbers are worrying, but they're not as worrying as they were in February of last year. So how worried are you that the war in Ukraine will, and then you insert item, how worried are you that the war in Ukraine will lead to Russian attacks elsewhere? In other words, how many people view this as really an expansionist war of the Russian Empire? 77% answered that they are worried in February of 2022. That is down to 64%. How worried are you that the war in Ukraine will lead to broader war in Europe? 80% answered they are worried in February 2022. Only 59% are worried now. How worried are you that the war in Ukraine will threaten U.S. national security? It's at 56 now, down from 72% when the war started. And so you can see amongst all these different categories, support is slipping. Now, I think those numbers are still too high, but you could see the narrative start to slip away. Now, what's interesting here is, of course, the partisan divide. So this is from the article that CNN did. They did a write-up about the findings of the poll where they get into this in a way that's just a little easier to read than it is to stare at the graphs more. So Democrats and Republicans far apart on how U.S. should help Ukraine. The survey finds broad partisan and ideological divides over how much the U.S. should be doing to assist Ukraine's efforts to push back the Russian military campaign. Republicans broadly say that Congress should not authorize new funding. 71% of Republicans say no new funding for Ukraine, and that the U.S. has done enough to help Ukraine. Among Democrats, most say the opposite. 62% favor additional funding. So you have only 29% of Republican voters favor funding World War III. 62% of Democratic voters favor funding World War III. That's amazing, but it gets worse. It gets worse. Within both parties, there are splits by ideology. On providing additional funding, liberal Democrats are far and away the most supportive. So progressive Democrats are the most supportive of funds for Ukraine. 74% of liberals, progressives, back it, compared with 51% of moderate or conservative Democrats. We did a segment on this last week, how the only 3 Democrats to vote for oversight of Ukraine funding were moderate Democrats. Sinema, who's technically an independent now, but she's basically a moderate Democrat for all intents and purposes. Then you had John Tester was one of the other ones, and then John Ossoff, swing state Georgia Democrat, vote for oversight. So it's the moderates who are the moderate Democrats. Shows like this exist to trash moderate Democrats. This whole space exists to trash moderate Democrats. Now we trash all Democrats. But at first we were like, okay, where are the Justice Democrats? We're the Squad. We're the Our Revolution Democrats. We're the Bernie Democrats. Now those Democrats are more likely to be war hawks than the shit-lib, neo-lib moderates. So talk about, not only are the parties upside down, the factions within the parties are switched around. Among Republicans, about 3/4 of conservatives oppose new funding, compared with 61% of moderate or liberal Republicans. So you have the moderate Republicans are more pro-war. You have the far-right Republicans are anti-war. The far-left Democrats are pro-war, and the moderate Democrats are anti-war. See how just chaotic that is? See what a just total breakdown in trends that is? It's an amazing poll. Independents mostly say the U.S. has done enough, 56, and that oppose additional funding, 55. So independents kind of define, they sort of balance out both parties and everything within. But just really, really fascinating numbers. Who'd have thought the centrist Democrats are the more anti-war coalition within the party than the squad? Amazing.
Well, because there are no progressives, really. There are no liberals in any true sense. All of that has been co-opted by institutional power and the establishment. And these people are at best useful idiots for establishment, corporate, institutional agendas. And as long as those are framed in terms of the kind of virtue signaling that David Brooks was talking about in our first segment, if you use a certain kind of language of virtue and decency and rightness and being on the side basically of the establishment, of the institutions, of the right, of the conventional wisdom, they've basically taken establishment agendas and reframed it as liberal virtue. That's how you wind up with a pro-war liberal class.
Yeah,
there are no.
That's
liberals.
A good way of putting it.
They're not liberals. They're just useful idiots for the establishment at best. Most of them are just trying to get theirs. They're just performers.
And they're brainwashed partisans too. And the fact that they're brainwashed partisans mean whatever the White House says, whatever the Democratic Party leadership says, they're going to be in lockstep. Whether you are, a liberal Katie Porter, Jamie Raskin type, or like a progressive AOC type, at this point they are party functionaries above all else. Whereas the moderate Democrats have to appeal to moderate voters. They have to appeal to independents. And that's it. That independents vote 55% no on more funding. If you're John Ossoff, if you're John Tester, if you're Kristen Sinema, you need those independents in order to win. Whereas a lot of the more progressive Democrats are in safer blue areas, so they can afford to just do whatever the party tells them to do.
Well, when I get on my Twitter feed, when I see a tweet from the squad, it's generally culture war bullshit. It's right. Very little about economics. If they say anything about economics, it's vague. It's very I'm for good stuff and against bad stuff. It's right. Very non-specific. Today I responded to a tweet from Ayanna Pressley. We are introducing legislation to take gender out of the legal code. Thanks. That's what they sent you to office for.
You're
no,
right.
I mean that's what I mean. People were like, Jesus, man, I'd really like higher wages. But what we really need is to get rid of gender in the language of legal speak.
Right, exactly. Right. Not to say stall a corporate infrastructure bill until the progressive infrastructure bill passes alongside.
No, that wasn't what we had in mind.
No, that wasn't what we had in mind. We were taken off guard by that.
And the phrasing and the language of it is like, this is a lunch counter protest in Selma in 1963. Like, God knows what kind of a brave and important stand they're taking by suggesting such a thing. Like anyone's even thinking about that. Like people are walking around like, man, I don't like the he, she in the legal code.
Right. Exactly.
Please clap.